Bienvenue à notre 93e Creative Mornings de Montréal.
Good morning, everyone. Ma première promesse, c'est la prochaine fois, ça va être en français, je vous le promets. Mais ce matin, ça va être en anglais. Firstly, I want to say that we are on unceded territory. It's something that I recognize and something that I acknowledge. And Montréal en Action is working hard to recognize that. Now, I want to take you to 1988 in West Virginia, in a Hindu community, and I am meditating in a temple. And as I sit there at 6 o'clock in the morning with my legs crossed, in my saffron clothes, as you see me there in the stroller, as I sit there and meditate and breathe, I begin to feel rooted in my spirituality. I begin to be very conscious of my surroundings, of the place that I am in. I feel the soft wood on my legs, on my heels. And I make a promise to myself. I promise, knowingly or unknowingly, that I would always be rooted in my spirituality, stay true to myself, always advance towards positivity, towards personal development, and stay rooted in personal development. Now, at a young age, when I make this promise, through this meditative state, sitting in this ashram, in a temple, in West Virginia, in the Hindu community, I don't know that this promise is going to have a massive impact and a monumental impact on my life. Now, you might be asking yourself, how am I in an ashram in a Hindu community in West Virginia? Well, it all begins in 1979, where my mother and my father meet here in Montreal au Forum de Montréal at a Bob Marley concert. And what's unique and beautiful about a Bob Marley concert is that the love, the music, the rebellion, the passion dissolves the fictitious divisions in society. My father is a Jamaican man from Saint Elizabeth. My mother, c'est une francophone aux yeux bleus, aux cheveux blonds. And they meet in this idyllic, beautiful arena, listening to love and rebellion, and somehow the language, his hair, my mother's hair, their skin color all dissolves and they meet and they fall in love. And ultimately, the divisions in society were dissolved at that very moment. And it is through that DNA through which I was born from. That is the source of my existence and really the mission up until this very day, which is to dissolve the fictitious divisions in society. Now, my mother, who is still shaken from the early death of her mother, finds solace in my father. And that was another strong bond that united them. My father, who is connected to Hinduism, to spirituality, assists her in coping with the death of her mother, who committed suicide while my mother witnessed this. And that solace pushes her towards Hinduism, towards spirituality. And at the age of 9 months, we moved to West Virginia. Now, because my mother was always working and my father was here in Montreal, the only thing I really had was my brother, my twin brother. And that is my twin brother and I. And what is on my shirt is actually a Hindu god by the name of Jagannatha, which is the name of my twin brother. And because I am in this situation where I do not have my parents around very often, I make a promise to my brother. And my brother makes a promise to me that we're always going to have each other's backs. Because God forbid, if I would lose my brother, or if I were to break that promise, I would really be isolated in a foreign land, in a place where I have no true support. And that was effectively the most important promise I made with my twin brother, who until this very day, our bond and that promise has been maintained. Now, all is not sunshine in my life and in this ashram, despite the fact that it is a wonderful experience. My mother, at the age of 10 years old, and in my life, I was 10 years old, my mother decides to move back to Quebec. And I find myself uprooted from the ashram, uprooted from spirituality, and I enter into the material world. In the ashram, spirituality, connecting with nature, connecting with people around you, is based on compassion, on tolerance, on respect for animals. We're raised vegetarian. All of a sudden, I find myself in Montreal. I don't speak French. I have a weird name. I don't eat meat. And I don't understand why, but I don't fit the mythical norm of what it means to be Canadian or Quebecer. During the referendum, I don't understand why, but I'm supposed to be no. And my mother and a lot of other people are for yes, and I am not too sure why. Now, over time, I find myself marginalized in society. The poverty I experience in the ashram and in West Virginia is imported right here in Quebec. So now I am a poor Anglophone with a funny name, vegetarian, here in Quebec. I am called the N-word by people around me. However, Black people don't see me as Black and white people don't see me as white enough. So I have this odd mix of where I fit in, and I fall off track. And what occurs is that once I fall off track, I get into drugs, marijuana, to be specific. I start drinking, and I drop out of secondary 4. And I fail secondary 4. And ultimately, I broke my promise. I broke my initial promise to stay true to myself, to love myself, to exercise personal development, to stay rooted in my spirituality. I fall off track, I drop out of school, I'm smoking weed, I'm drinking, and I fail secondary 4. Now, one evening, I'm watching Monday Night Football. I'm 18 years old. I am 5'11", 180 pounds with brown skin, and I see someone on TV with brown skin playing football. He's 5'11", 180 pounds. And I make a promise to myself at that very moment, like an epiphany, like a shock of lightning coming right through me. And I say, I promise to myself that I am going to reestablish and reconnect myself with this very same values, the same resilience, the same patience, and the same love for myself that I promised myself at 5 years old in the temple as I was meditating. And this all goes to say is not only does representation matter, but keeping your promise to yourself matters. And once I made that promise, 7 years later, I would become a Grey Cup champion. I would earn my first of 5 degrees. And my first degree is health science and geography. The second one was education, because I was inspired and empowered by education. I felt education mixed with spirituality would dissolve those fictitious divisions in society. Then I had a master's in education because I pushed it to another level. And then law, because law is effectively in our society the architects of our society. Now, what occurs is when I keep that promise, I end up really living out and meeting my potential. And my rebellion no longer becomes marijuana and alcohol. My rebellion becomes, I'm going to use education to empower myself to make a difference in my community. And now we're going to go to breakout rooms, and I want you to think about this question. When have you ever broken a promise, just like I did when I reared off track? But have you ever had reconciliation? Were you ever able to go back and to fuse back the bond between that broken promise and a promise kept? When were you ever able to go back and repair a broken promise? So I want you to think about that. And if you have a challenge to think about a promise that you broke, well, think about what promise have you ever made to yourself? And you might not say, I promise, but almost intuitively, instinctively, a promise that you gave yourself or made yourself, or maybe even someone else. And maybe you didn't completely break it, but maybe you fell off track a little bit. And now it's time to get back on track to maintain that promise or to keep that promise. So I want you to think about that. Key terms, think of rekindling, reconciliation, and bond, and reconnecting, and keeping promises. That's what I want you to think about in this next breakout room. Okay, well, thank you, and thanks for everyone's input. So interesting and inspiring. One interesting thing that I'll say is that we all have beautiful stories, interesting stories that are intricate. All of us can be doing this presentation on promise and thinking about our lives and reflecting on made promises, broken promises, obstacles, transitions. So I would encourage you all to think about your narrative and think about promise as it relates to your life, because we all have these interesting, intricate, beautiful stories. Mine is not unique. I think we've heard from the breakout rooms and from the feedback that we all have, very, very, very beautiful things to share. So I want to take you to September 2017. This is after I spent 2 years abroad, and I was in Egypt, in China, in Malaysia, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, Turkey, Morocco. I traveled the world, and I looked back at Montreal and I said, why is it that the very element that, in my view, forced me to break my promise, which was divisions in society, why was it that the city that I was born in did not love, respect, and include me? It was something that really, really bothered me, for lack of a better term. So I came back to Montreal in 2017. I entered into McGill Law, and I decided that I was going to make an impact in my community to ensure that anyone who kept a promise to be true to themselves, or had a promise that they were going to meet their fullest potential, or had a promise that they wanted to occupy any employment or any career or any passion of theirs, that they can keep that promise. That the elements that made me break my promise and get off track, I was going to ensure that I was going to limit the amount of broken promises right here in my city. That if you wanted to be a lawyer, a doctor, an artist, a musician, or you wanted to get any job in any space in the city, or if you wanted to be a member of City Hall or a member of Parliament, or you wanted to, start a business, that you could do anything you want in your city and that the city would represent you. So what I did in 2017, I decided that I was going to hit the heart of the issues right here in Montreal, and I was going to run for mayor of Montreal North, the poorest borough in all of Canada. A borough that was led by Denis Coderre, who was a member of parliament for 16 years and the incumbent mayor. And I knew I wasn't going to win the political battle, but I was going to win the moral and the ethical battle. And I was going to highlight the issues in Montreal North, whether it was urban density and poverty, whether it was lacking sports and leisure and recreation infrastructure, whether it was unemployment rates, whether it was issues of health, whether it was issues of public security. I was going to go highlight the issues right then and there. And I ran the election, I highlighted the issues, and immediately after, something happened that shocked a lot of different people. When the election was over, I kept going. And a lot of politicians would think, why is he still campaigning? The election is over. Well, to their dismay, for me, it was never about an election and it was never about politics. It was about keeping a promise to ensure that any boy or girl, regardless of your skin tone, can be a productive and full member of society right here in Montreal. And I announced 30 days after this election that I promised to collect 15,000 signatures to trigger a participatory democracy clause in the Montreal Charter. And as you know, Montreal does have a charter. And we have a beautiful clause that says any citizen that collects 15,000 signatures forces a public consultation. Let's have a conversation about the broken promises that the state and the city has towards minority communities. Because right here in Canada, life, liberty, security is protected. Your ability to go get a job, employment equity is protected through a promise, through law, and those promises are broken. And my goal was to fuse and to rekindle those broken promises to ensure that everyone can have really a productive member of society and meet their fullest potential. So I go out with 50 young people, and those are the leaders right there, and they all had teams. And we collected 22,000 signatures to force a public consultation on systemic racism and discrimination right here in Montreal. And then the pandemic hits. The epicenter of the COVID-19 pandemic was the very borough that I ran in to point out the broken promises, Montreal North. So all the issues of unemployment, the issues of urban density, the issues of housing, the issues of health, the issues of immigration and not protecting vulnerable communities were exposed with the pandemic. So the pandemic effectively magnified and exemplified inequalities in society. So the promises that were broken and never articulated, whether it was by the government at the municipal or provincial or federal level, now those broken promises were exposed. Discrimination and racism in Montreal and in Canada often lives in silence and it reproduces in silence. So you never hear about the broken promises. It's difficult to actually identify them, but the pandemic exposed them. And so the work of Montreal in Action was put to the forefront, and we collectively made a promise. We said that we promise that anyone in Montreal who wants to meet their fullest potential, well, they can. And we promise to the next generation that we are going to build a society that is inclusive, that's tolerant, that is just, that is fair. And that is the society that we want to have. And the goal, as Martin Luther King famously says, the arc of the moral universe bends towards justice. And the goal for all of us is to make a collective promise that we accelerate that change and we push morality towards that arc, towards justice. And we hope, we hope because we are optimistic, that we are going to build a society that is more inclusive and more prosperous. So my question that I want you to reflect on, this could possibly happen after, and there's my baby daughter. And the question that I want you to reflect on is, can we make a collective promise together? And that is the exchange of power. It's no longer just me making a promise. We are collectively making a promise that we're going to do everything in our power to ensure that the next generation can live in a green, in a prosperous, in a tolerant, and a compassionate society where anyone who has a promise to develop their fullest potential, well, they can meet their fullest potential. And the more promises we can keep, the more capacity we can build, and the more power we can build, and the better chance we will have of pushing justice on that moral arc at a faster rate. And we can guarantee that indeed baby Bella Angelique Holness, and all of our kids can, and I said our kids, not just my kids, our kids can live in a society that is more just and more fair.
There are a lot of questions regarding if you are going to run for office this year.
Pas de promis. No promise that I'm going to run for office. What you know, and what differentiates me from a lot of different, if you will, politicians, is that during an election, I can openly say, I'm not here for your votes. The point is to highlight how we could be better as a society. And you have extreme liberty, and you could stay so authentic if you're not there for the political gain. You're there to push that cart on the moral arc of the universe towards justice. That's the only reason why you are there. So whether someone votes for me or not, it doesn't matter. So if I decide to run for mayor of Montreal, I don't have to shift my rhetoric, if you lack a better term. I don't have to shift my policy platform. I don't have to change and flip-flop from idea to idea. I don't have to oversell myself. I can simply be myself, just as that young boy in the ashram promised to be himself, to live up to his fullest potential, and to be honest, to have strong values. That's all I have to do if I run for mayor of Montreal. And that for us is a winning formula, because at the end of the week, or at the end of the election, just as I did in 2017, we go to a different bank. We are not going to bank those six-figure paychecks as politicians. We are banking equity and equality and justice. And right now, there are literally dozens of city officials and millions of dollars that have been injected in the consultation, that have been injected in action plans for these recommendations. So you're always going to win the ethical and moral battle, if you will, when you're true to yourself, especially in the political arena when the majority are there for the wrong reasons.
Thank
So
you.
me running, it's an open question. I am not sure yet. However, we are playing a different game than the majority of the politicians who are out there.
I suppose that when you felt rejected when you were younger, it was like by individual and by the system. So sometimes like the system say like, oh, it's because the people are not ready to change. And then the people say, oh, it's because of the system. So we have to change. But which one do you think like need to change first? Like which ones start like the trickling effect?
Oh, yeah. Veronique, that's a very good question. and it brings me to what systemic racism is. So you have, je vais parler en français. il y a des lois, des pratiques et des protocoles, et le dérivé a un impact sur les personnes racisées ou marginalisées. Donc ça, c'est des lois, des protocoles, des pratiques. Maintenant, il y a un autre côté de l'équation, c'est il y a des attitudes, il y a des comportements, il y a des idéologies d'un processus social qui supportent ces lois et ces protocoles-là. Mais on ne peut pas les diviser. Donc, par exemple, si je me fais appeler le mot en haine en classe, c'est une chose, c'est un processus social, mais aussi quand je m'en vais au dépanneur et je me fais suivre, c'est aussi un processus social, mais aussi, il peut y avoir des lois et des protocoles, par exemple, mon père qui est noir, excusez-moi, qui se fait évincer parce qu'on dit qu'il y a trop de livres chez lui. Et donc, à cet égard-là, j'ai un parent noir qui se fait évincer. Ça, c'est des lois, et donc on lui amène en cours. Et donc ça a un impact énorme sur moi. Et là, il y a aussi un processus social. Mais on ne peut pas séparer ces deux choses-là. Et c'est comme ça qu'il faut faire la réflexion. Et dernièrement, on voit que vous avez tout le monde dans cette salle électronique, whatever, virtuelle, que vos comportements et vos attitudes et la façon que vous pouvez influencer les personnes autour de vous peut avoir un impact énorme sur le Québec. Donc, ce n'est pas seulement l'Assemblée nationale qui est responsable, mais en tant que citoyen, if you share love, if you're compassionate, if you are understanding your implicit biases, well, you can help eliminate or mitigate racism through that social process that we cannot oversee. But both are inextricably linked together.
Most people say, well, I'm not racist. However, we are. Is it possible that we can open that further, that envelope, to gain more on the racist aspect by addressing discrimination per se, whether it's economic or, as you say, the neighborhood of...
Yeah, so that's a good question, and I'll answer it really in two parts. The first one is the easy part, and everyone can go look at this. S15 of the Canadian Constitution of the Charter of Rights gives you the grounds in which the state understands how you can be discriminated: ethnicity, nationality, citizenship, sexual orientation, ability, disability, et cetera, okay? Also, there are what we call social rights. So the right to healthcare, and you could be, in the right to housing, and there's all different forms of rights that you can have that are interconnected, okay? Now, when you do a public consultation on systemic racism and discrimination, I can call for, I want it on citizenship, ethnicity, nationality, LGBTQ. At times you need to focus. And that's what the City of Montreal did with this public consultation. It was specific to really what we call visible minorities, Indigenous communities, marginally people with disabilities, and women. So it was you have to narrow the analysis at one point. So that's number one. Number two, you cannot be neutral, and we call this color blindness, recognizing someone's ethnicity, and that value is important. And this is where I'll conclude, because you have a great question that could be actually like a 3-hour talk. But what's important to note, I think one of the big takeaways from this conversation is intersectional identity, and you loving that intersectional identity about yourself. So you could be British, heterosexual, artist who is of a certain age, who is a father and possibly a grandfather, and all of those intersecting identities make who you are. And we will go a long ways in the fight against racism and discrimination if people begin to love who they are. Because the biggest issue is you have communities of color, the Black community, Indigenous community, and otherwise even Asian communities, depending on where you're from. And the state kind of teaches you not to love you yourself. So you are the N-word, or you are poor, or you are debased. And that ends up hurting people on a personal level. So ultimately, there are a range of different persons, a range of different ways you can be discriminated. But if we can kind of bring it to one core answer, is your intersectional identity on a human personal level should be acknowledged, should be loved. You should feel enriched by your identity. And whether you have an accent or you don't speak the language here in Quebec, or whether you are from the LGBTQ community and you're a person of color or you're trans, regardless of what it is, you actually accept and love yourself. You're going to have pushback by the state that says, like Audre Lorde would say, a famous poet, you don't fit the mythical norm of what it means to be accepted, but you got to push that away. And you have to love and cherish who you are within your intersectional identity. And that will give us a head start in the fight against racism and discrimination.
I made a promise to my daughter to help with an initiative that's happening at her school, where they basically want to increase awareness about the diversity of the school population and about the fact that schools with selective criteria are not able to really open the doors to diverse cultural communities because there's so many barriers that are in place. How can a student from within an administration, a school administration, push the envelope a little bit, move the dial, and really make the student population and the administration aware of the barriers that are facing cultural communities and minority groups in particular?
As a student at the University of McGill in law, we have Supreme Court justices come speak to us. And you know, when they came to speak to us in particular during op-ed week, you might ask yourself, why is a Supreme Court Justice of Canada, the highest court in the land, coming to speak to us during op-ed week? Why? I would tell this young student, boy or girl, you have to advance public dialogue, and is mobilizing people, writing letters, speaking to city news, global news, city TV. You would be shocked that many of our media in this democracy are open to these types of stories. So I would say, look beyond your classroom, get 4, 5, 6 students together, pen an open letter, and have all students write an open letter, start a petition, and Google city news, global news, send out a press release and say, this is happening in my school. It's Black History Month and the programming is performative and we don't do anything beyond that. And if young people begin to rise up and articulate those ideas, public dialogue will shift. And that is what Montreal in Action did. We used our democracy. We used legal clauses, we use our charter, and the media in our country, which is a free, like other countries. I lived in Egypt for a year, I lived in Dubai for a year. Media is censored. Do not underestimate the power of journalism right here in Canada. And young people, even in Montreal in Action, we have people who are 16 and 17 on our panels for Black History Month. We are empowering the next generation. So I would encourage them to, as my father would say, my father says this: if you want someone to respect you, you have to beat them at their own game. But he's like, I go above their heads. So the young boys and girls, don't go see your principal, don't go see your teachers, go above their heads. Go to the Ministry of Education, go to different media outlets, go to social media, go above their heads, and then they'll be coming to see you at your desk.
Perfect. I'm going to share with them this webinar so that they can use that and be inspired
if they need
by
help,
you.
just tell them to add me on Instagram, send me a DM, and I'll help them out. It would be a pleasure.